So welcome everybody to, this is our third session in our, what is it, 22nd year? Or am I underestimating? I'm underestimating. Our 29th year? No, our many years. This is a very old seminar, constantly rejuvenated every week, and we're really delighted to have you all here this week. I'm Jerry Singerman. I'm the Senior Humanities Editor at the University of Pennsylvania Press, and the press editor for the Material Text series that coordinates with this workshop. I'm joined here by Zach Lesser, who is the faculty director of the workshop. So say hello, hey everyone. Zach.
Welcome back, or welcome for the first time.
Yeah. And John Pollack, curator at the Kislak Center, who is our librarian convener. He is not in the library right now, so don't be deceived.
I'm from a secret location.
Yeah, okay. And then there is Philip Mogan, who is our graduate coordinator and the person who really makes all of this happen. So Philip.
Hey everyone, welcome.
Yeah, and if any of you have wandered in without being on the listserv, Philip is the go-to person to get onto the listserv. Just email him at phmogen, phmogan@sas.upenn.edu. And then the additional present person who we cannot ignore is the founding director of the workshop in the history of material texts, the person without whom none of this would ever have happened. That's Peter Stallybrass. And
hi.
Yeah, we're delighted to see Peter. We're delighted to see all those people, but we're especially delighted to see Derrick Spires today. Derrick took his undergraduate degree at Tougaloo College and his MA and PhD at Vanderbilt. He's held fellowships from the Library Company of Philadelphia and the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others, and he was a Mellon Foundation Caltech Huntington Library postdoctoral fellow in the years 2013 to 2014. Derrick was on the faculty of the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana from 2012 to 2018. And since 2019, he's been Associate Professor of English with affiliations in the programs in American Studies and Visual and Media Studies at Cornell. He's the general editor of the forthcoming Broadview Anthology of American Literature, and he is the convener of the Just Teach One Early African American Print Initiative at the American Antiquarian Society. I'm very pleased that, as far as I could tell from his vita, the University of Pennsylvania Press actually published Derrick's first scholarly essay, which was Imagining a Nation of Fellow Citizens in Lara Cohn and Jordan Stein's Early African American Print Culture volume, which was in turn a book that emerged from a symposium at the Library Company. So the Philadelphia roots are there and much welcome. But I'm even more delighted that when it came time to place his book, Derrick came to the University of Pennsylvania Press. And the book of which that first essay was a part is, of course, The Practice of Citizenship, Black Politics and Print Culture in the Early United States, which was published in the Material Text series in 2019, so just a year ago. The book examines how, in the years between the American Revolution and the Civil War, as legal and cultural understandings of citizenship grew more racially restrictive, Black writers and thinkers utilized the power of print to articulate an expansive practice-based theory of citizenship, of the citizenship that they were denied by law. The book has so far won Best Book Awards of the Midwest Modern Language Association and was co-winner of the St. Louis Mercantile Library Bibliographic Society of America Book Award. It also has been a finalist for the Best First Book Award of the Library Company of Philadelphia. Gabrielle Foreman has written of the book and of Derrick's work, and I quote, "Derrick Spires orchestrates insightful readings of both the most important and underutilized touchstones in early Black print studies like a master conductor. By having an array of early Black authors, events, and exchanges in play together, and by amplifying how early Black writers and communities created, enlivened, and sustained collective advocacy, Spires' work is poised to significantly expand the canon of 19th century texts scholars write about and teach." In a review in Reviews in American History, Benjamin Fagan called the book absolutely necessary, and wrote as follows: "With an ease made all the more impressive because of its seeming effortlessness, Spires offers his readers a well-cleared pathway into the world of Black theorizing in the 19th century, and thus provides us with an opportunity to learn from activist writers who developed and enacted practices of citizenship that engaged with, but refused to be bound by, the rules and regulations of a white supremacist state. And as an interpreter of and guide through these practices, Spires models for us Black theorizing in the 21st century, an approach that is at once scholarly method and ethical imperative. It is an inspired and inspiring work filled with theories and practices that are as necessary now as they were then." Derrick is currently working on a new book project, Serial Blackness, Periodical Literature and Early African American Literary Histories in the Long 19th Century. And it is no doubt from that project that this evening's talk is drawn. So we are all looking forward to hearing Derrick present on Aliened American Women, Tracing Fanny Homewood and Pseudonymity in the Black Press. Derrick will speak for half hour or so. When he is done, the floor will be open for discussion and questions and answers. So just to participate, use the raise hand function in your Zoom, and I will call upon you. And please be better about unmuting yourself than I tend to be when befuddled by Zoom. Without further babbling, really, again, great pleasure to welcome Derrick, and very much looking forward to what is to come. So Derrick, take it away.
I'm not sure I want to give the talk now after that introduction. Thank you so much for your generosity through getting the book through the process and for that introduction. I also want to thank the History of Material Text Collective for inviting me and for everyone for joining in on this Tuesday afternoon. I want to thank Ben Fagan, Bridget Fielder, Sierra Humphrey, and the Civil War Caucus for their feedback on this project at various points. It's very much a work in progress, but already many different people have fed into it. And I want to say here that I'm building on work from Ben, Carla Peterson, and Radhiklani Kleitis, who continue to teach me new ways of thinking about this community. And in fact, the scholarly collective that I'm happy to be a part of often replicates the kind of, Carla will call it gossip, in a good way, of the people we write on. So I'm going to share the screen for a bit and then stop sharing and then share again as the need arises. All right, that worked. Great. Title of my talk is Aliened American Women, Tracing Fanny Homewood and Pseudonymity in the Black Press. In the middle of a heated debate with William Howard Day about a proposed industrial school in 1854, James McCune Smith published the following May 12, 1854 missive in Frederick Douglass's paper under his pseudonym, Communipaw. Quote, "It's a pretty rural sight and sound to witness Brother Day gallanting Maria and Becky and Nancy and Fanny over his barnyard, astonishing them with his bantam strut and squeaky crowing, while he boastfully cries, 'Hens, you are hens, and I know it,' end quote. The hens to whom Communipaw refers is a coterie of Black women correspondents, today's short-lived newspaper, The Alien American, published from 1853 to 1854. Mariah, Becky, Nancy, and Homewood apparently wrote for the paper regularly and may have been partners in its operations. I say apparently because only one issue of The Alien is extant so far as I or anyone else knows. Who are these correspondents and how might we reconstruct their work and its meaning given this absence? Well, two of the names are identified relatively easily. Fanny Homewood is Mary Frances Vashon Colder, daughter of prominent Pittsburgh activist and War of 1812 veteran John B. Vashon, and former student of Sarah Mapps Douglas's Female Institute in Philadelphia. By the time she died of cholera in 1854, Vashon Colder had become a prominent voice in Black periodicals. Mariah was a New York correspondent, whom other New York writers referred to often as Home Mariah. Beyond these details, we know from this and similar moments that they existed. Smith assumed enough of his readers were aware of their work to play on their names, and they were a part of a larger pseudonymous cohort central to how Black intellectuals created community throughout the mid-19th century. So this talk outlines preliminary research on women correspondents in the Alien American as a guide for understanding pseudonymity as a wider cultural phenomena in mid-19th century Black newspapers and Black women's intellectual history. The moment serves as one entree into a larger print landscape of aesthetic play and social and political networking, something we can think of as early Black social media. I acknowledge that starting a talk that's centered on women writers with Smith's words is somewhat counterintuitive. It is also the case, though, that I would not have seen them if not for Smith's beef with Day, because I don't have access to any issues of the Alien American aside from the first. Just as scholars of enslavement often read against the colonial archives to see the creativity of enslaved people, I find myself in the position of reading through and against writers like Smith as I try to piece together this cohort of writers. Methodologically then, the Alien's incomplete archive represents a problem familiar to print culture and Black studies. How to proceed in the absence of evidence when the evidence is fractured or when source materials attesting to Black lives come from the archives of attempted erasure. From Julia C. Collins' The Curse of Caste to Martin R. Delaney's Blake, scholars of 19th century African American literature have been developing strategies for recovering, reconstituting, or reparatively recuperating fragmented, incomplete, or unfinished work for years. Saidiya Hartman, Christina Sharp, and others have also proffered new strategies for narrating Black lives that acknowledge and check the impulse to suture absences and the limits of our own language. They all invite us to engage in what Hartman aptly calls critical fabulation, that is, in her words, laboring to paint as full a picture of the lives and creative work of Black people as we can. This talk makes a related claim about Black print culture, not to pretend we will recover a complete sense of what was, but rather to engage in, to fabricate as full and sustaining for us and them, a picture as we can of this print expressive culture by highlighting the cultural work these correspondences did in shaping a collective and collaborative print movement. Approaching pseudonymity from the Alien American provides a different vector into thinking about gender and antebellum Black print culture, particularly the language around women's writing, the print communities they created, and the ways Vashon Colder, Mary Ann Shadd, Frances Ellen Watkins, and others responded to misogynoir, Moya Bailey and Trudy's term for misogyny directed toward and experienced by Black women. Even when we cannot access some of their writing directly, we can still see the political aesthetic patterns of their wake. So just to give you a little bit of background on pseudonymity in the Black press. By the time Smith's Communipaw letter appeared in May 1854, Smith had been writing as Communipaw for over 2 years, establishing the persona as a leading cultural and political voice in Douglas's paper. As Carla Peterson, Roddy Klein-Clytus, and John Stauffer note, he was part of a cohort of pseudonymous correspondence that included Ethiop, that is William J. Wilson, Observer, that is John N. Steele, Philo, that is George C. Downing, and Charlotte Kay, and others. Pseudonymous writing was not new in Black newspapers, though. Pseudonymous essays and letters to the editor were a staple in Black periodicals from the start. Sarah Fortin, for instance, published poetry under Ada in Freedom's Journal and essays in The Liberator under Magawiska. And the short story, Teresa, a Haitian Tale, appeared under S in Freedom's Journal, now canonical thanks to Frances Smith Foster's efforts. Colored American featured debates between Augustine and Viator, as well as Sidney's defense of Black state conventions. In American letters more broadly, pseudonymity was adapted from Richard Steele's Isaac Bickerstaff, political writing in revolutionary and early Republic newspapers, most recognizably in the Federalist Papers, and popular literature, including Washington Irving's Geoffrey Crayon and Walter Scott's Jedediah Clishenbotham, who was a favorite of both Smith, Wilson, as well as Frederick Douglass. Mid-century Black writers took to pseudonymity knowing this history, and as Carla Peterson argues in a forthcoming ALH article, one of their projects was forging new spaces relative to it. What makes the 1850s different is the sense of writers producing intentionally a social landscape and ongoing conversation through pseudonymity. Using a pseudonym in the 1850s Black newspapers signaled participation in this project at a building an intellectual community aimed explicitly at Black audiences and exploring the contours of Black life, a community focused on establishing, as Clytus has argued, the basis for a performative Black epistolary culture, his words, a staged belletrism, as it were. While Douglas's paper had the most sustained cohort, other papers also had cohorts, and such coteries were becoming the mark of a strong paper. Anyone taking up a pseudonym in the Black press at this time declared tacit belonging to this group of writers who would hold them to a standard of literary excellence. Pseudonymous writing was not necessarily about anonymity, gendered or otherwise. Participants and observant readers either knew or could often parse the figures behind the names. As Philip A. Bell's March 7, 1854 letter to Frederick Douglass's paper notes Riley, quote, "My signature of cosmopolite can scarcely be called anonymous, as I have been well known by that name for years, having corresponded under that title to the Mystery, Elevator, and other papers," end quote. Newspapers, including Douglas's paper, Christian Recorder, and others, sometimes revealed pseudonymous correspondence in their acknowledgement of contributors, in obituaries, or as Danita Rose. We learn, for instance, that Vashon Colder wrote as Fanny Homewood from a notice of her death in Douglas's paper. And Mary Shadd's provincial freedman unmasked Q as Shadd's sister Amelia in an 1856 editorial following libel accusations against the freedman. And in this case, Shadd was explicitly shifting blame over to Q to prevent the freedman from being sued. In this sense, Lara Cohen's observation in relation to Fanny Fern about pseudonymity as, quote, not naming, but a positive claim to artifice, end quote, applies well here. Pseudonymity was not necessarily about drawing attention away from embodied Blackness, Black womanhood, or producing disembodied anonymous selves, but rather was a way to craft collaboratively a fulfilling and complex thought world. Action happened in the meanwhile between articles, and what we see in print continues in those off the pages interactions. In an 1855 correspondence for Douglas's paper to his cousin Woodland Mary, for instance, Ethiop describes hanging out with Charlotte Kay and lodging with Veritas in Philadelphia during the 1855 National Convention. Ethiop may have been the most assiduous in maintaining this conceit, but he was not alone in it. Fanny Homewood invites Ethiop to come through Pittsburgh in a riff on Ethiop's continually wanting people to visit Brooklyn. Seems like all Brooklyn people are like that, but it is what it is. And Communipaw writes about attending a performance by the Black Swan, Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, with Cosmopolite, Ethiop, and Observer. More than simple pen names, the pseudonymous persona take on elements of fully fleshed out characters in a Black print space, an early analog to Black Twitter. And like Twitter, only the truly initiated, Friend Douglas, fellow pseudonymous personas, and the people immediately involved in the drama would be completely in on the jokes. Yet, even general readers willing to invest the time and money into consistent newspaper consumption could catch up. So While the above description highlights the openness of Black pseudonymity, individual writers thought of the space and its gender dynamics differently. Pseudonymous correspondents in Douglas's paper were largely, but not exclusively, men, and their writing has led John Stauffer to describe pseudonymous correspondence in Douglas's paper as, quote, a secret fraternal organization with a female auxiliary, end quote. That characterization is only tenable for Douglas's paper, and it might not hold even there. The Alien American stands out not in its employment of writers using women-identified pseudonyms, but rather in their concentration and apparent centrality within the paper's print community. And now I'm gonna share a screen again. And there's the Alien American. Attending to pseudonymity beyond Douglas's paper in general, and in Alien American in particular, allows us to read this collective as salon-like in nature, rather than fraternal. A speakeasy even, think of Sugar Ray's joint from Harlem Nights, where one needed to signal belonging in particular ways. But this exclusivity was always under pressure and in tension with an energy grounded in the popular. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, give you a little background on the Alien American and transition into speaking about its correspondence. Though short-lived, the Alien American garnered enthusiastic notices, and its disappearance in 1854 resulted in several notes of longing and even an elegiac poem. And while we have access to only its first issue, we can reconstruct at least some of the paper's character, contents, and impact, if not circulation numbers, from articles reprinted in other papers, from articles about the paper, and from how organizations like the Colored Conventions made use of it. By the time William Howard Day published the Alien's first issue on April 9th, 1853, he was already an experienced newspaper printer and reporter with strong local newspaper and Black activist networks backing him. Born in New York in 1825, Day was adopted by white activists in Northampton, Massachusetts after his father died. There, he gained considerable skill in Latin and Greek and was apprenticed as a printer before heading to Oberlin College in 1843. While at Oberlin, Day worked as a typesetter for the Oberlin Evangelist and attracted attention as an orator. Day graduated in 1847, worked as a compositor and reporter for the Cleveland True Democrat from 1851 to 1852, and married fellow Oberlin graduate Lucy Stanton in 1852 before starting the Alien in April 1853. While Day gets editorial and professional cred, however, Stanton is the linchpin, the connector in this origin story. Stanton likely solidified the paper's connection to Cleveland Black activists and funders, and by extension, helped create the conditions for Day to found the paper. A Cleveland native and the first Black graduate of Oberlin's Ladies Department in 1850, Stanton grew up in a hub of Underground Railroad activity run by her stepfather, John Brown, the other one. Day printed and edited the paper in Cleveland with a press he bought with financial backing from Stanton, her stepfather, Henry Bibb, and others. The paper lists prominent Black activists James Pennington and Samuel Ringo Ward as corresponding editors. They employed a network of agents spanning the Midwest, Northeast, and Canadian provinces, and subscriptions went for $1.50 per year. The first issue of the paper offered minutes from that year's state convention, which took up most of the first page. Day, however, reserved the first column for poetry reprinted from Godey's Lady's Book and the short story Charles and Clara Hayes, written for the Alien by Mrs. Lucy Stanton Day. The issue also included an article critiquing the family opposed to newspapers, an article reprinted from Hunt's Merchants magazine recounting the first trip of the Erickson, a new kind of steamship, and Mahalia Maguire's letters from Sierra Leone addressed to Day. Alien also printed convention minutes and meeting minutes regularly, including minutes from the 1853 Cleveland Women's Rights Convention and Ohio Black State Conventions, which were then reprinted in other papers. This assemblage suggests the paper's ranging diasporic aspirations, as well as Day's determination to make the paper a syllabus for a liberal education. The paper's importance to African American literary history should not be overlooked. And again, it comes back to Lucy Stanton. Stanton's story, Charles and Clara Hayes, is one of the earliest recorded African American short stories, published less than a year after Douglas's more famous Heroic Slave, and 6 years before Harper's The Two Offers, which was published first in the Anglo-African magazine in 1859. The short narrative tells the story of siblings whose white father was also their enslaver and plays on classic sentimental anti-slavery and romantic tropes of violated manhood, the centrality of literacy, conversion to true Christianity, and a protective masculinity. Charles escapes after having violently defended himself against an overseer who violated his independent spirit. He falls short of killing the man out of consideration for how his actions might affect his sister, Clara, but flees north thereafter, leaving her behind. The narrative concludes with Clara arriving on Charles's doorstep some years later, without revealing how, just after Charles begins questioning God's justness in leaving him free and her enslaved. While Charles marries in the narrative, Clara's story, like Harriet Jacobs' Linda, ends with freedom, not in the usual way, with marriage. The story's concern for a sibling speaks to experiences common to many fugitives and rehearses a theme central to Stanton's Oberlin Commencement Address, where a brother tamed the fire of his eye, toiled for that which profited him not, and labored so industriously for his sister's sake, only to be murdered when he defends her from an overseer's lash. Inasmuch as the story resonates with Heroic Slave, Douglas's reconstruction of the 1841 insurrection of the Creole led by Madison Washington, it also continues a line of Stanton's thought that predates Douglas's story. Stanton's male protagonist shows a vulnerability and sense of survivor's remorse not present in Heroic Slave, but running throughout freedom narratives recorded in Henry Bibb's Narrative of the Life, Jacob's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, William Still's Underground Railroad, and likely encountered by Stanton herself in her stepfather's home. Yet, despite Alien American's popularity and respect from its peers, a combination of financial woes that plagued many American newspapers, Day's flagging health, and the stress he and Stanton faced at the deaths of their two infant children in 1853 and 1854 led to the paper's flagging sometime in mid-1854, to much confusion and dismay. Responses to the alien's demise provide one final measure of the importance others attached to it in its correspondence. In a September 22, 1854 letter, Ethiop soothes his longing during a prolonged silence from Communipaw and others with the blessed remembrance of the host of correspondence, including Home Maria and Fanny Homewood of the dear alien. Alas, my dear Douglas, Ethiop cries, where are they? Whither are they gone? Ethiop returns to this theme in a December 1st, 1854 letter, referring to Maria and Fanny Homewood as master spirits, with special reference to Homewood. Quote, I cannot say in this short space what duty and respect to her and her talents require of me. Though short was my acquaintance, and hence I lay my pen aside to reflect upon the sad breach made by her absence from us, end quote. The articles are all the more poignant because Vashon Colder had recently died during a June 1854 cholera outbreak in Pittsburgh. In addition to Ethiop's letters, a poem published in Douglas's paper on July 28, 1854 under Nemo memorialized the alien American and the community it fostered. The intentionally bad poem, at least I hope it's intentionally bad, is filled with punning and humorously toasts a fallen comrade. This light having fixed to its nucleus, we mean the place where each ray meets a ray. Ah, its focus for mistakes, excuse us. A light in itself, a real day. Seeming bright, clear, sunny, not nebulous. A perfect godsend, as some folks would say. The poem, bad puns and all, articulates the alien's impact on the Black print community and the intentionality behind crafting a pseudonymous social world, offering the most complete list of pseudonymous writers for the paper I've come across, including Spectator, Viator, Arcator, Veritas, quote, and ladies of whose names we'll mention, Fanny Homewood, Mariah, and Ida, of whose sex there needs be no contention, end quote. Ethiop's letters and Nemo's poems, among other pieces from across the Black press, affirm my sense of women writers' centrality, not only to the alien American's character, but to its success. It's important slice of evidence because none of these writers appear in the alien American's first issue. However, even as Nemo assures readers that Homewood, Mariah, and Ida were indeed women writers, and suggests that they were three among many, the stanza's final line gets to the heart of the problem they faced. The line implicates at least two instances of correspondence to Douglas's paper, either challenging their gender identity or using it to highlight the alien Americans and Day's flaws. This attitude, however, was not uniform, and women correspondents did not let misogyny go unchecked. So when Communipod delivered the hinge jibe with which I began, he delivered it after Fanny Homewood had already taken Ethiop to task for using her gender as a joke. This first confrontation provides instructive traces of Fanny Homewood's voice, the cultural work Vashon Coulter undertook through the pseudonym, and the implicit slipperiness pseudonymity exposes. The confrontation begins in a March 17, 1854 Ethiop letter that includes an extended metaphor meant to ridicule the alien American. Quote, Ethiop analogizes the paper's composition to an innocent collective of caterers preparing a vegetarian mental feast that has been successful so far. But, Ethiop warns in a big brother verging on patronizing tone, these, quote, young innocents should avoid stepping into conversations best left to more seasoned veterans, lest, Ethiop warns, we be denied this weekly innocent little repast. Ethiop couches his sharpest barbs in hearsay, using Homewood and others as props. A lady asking after Day wonders if, quote, he having called so beseechingly upon the ladies to correspond that now their contributions had completely enveloped him, end quote. Ethiop suggests Day actively cultivated a cohort of women correspondents, but the dig turns Day into a fop who has lost his editorial voice, if not his editorial chair, to these same women. More, suspicion says Homewood and Mariah might be pushing boundaries beyond the page, quote, dressed in something more than full bloomer costume, eye to the gloves, hat, and boots, end quote. They're either men using women's names or, maybe worse, women who are assuming men's dress and positions. Homewood did not find Ethiop funny. She responded in the Alien American sometime in late March or early April in a way that not only settled her gender expression, but also hit hard. We know because Ethiop replied to her on April 22, 1854. Homewood's rhetorical thorns, thistles, and switches felt to Ethiop like a thrashing his mother once delivered for what she deemed some slight. Homewood renegotiates the power dynamic and invites Ethiop to visit her in Pittsburgh for a chat and to sip with her and hers a cup of that fine Ethiopian coffee. In other words, I don't come to dogs, dogs come to me. It's worth pausing here. Vashon Coulter, a member of the famous Vashon family, a pillar of Pittsburgh Black activist community and Underground Railroad activity, was not to be trifled with. She was educated, as I said, by Sarah Mapps Douglas and had adopted Fanny after her grandmother, who had been enslaved in Virginia. In that sense, Mary Frances had at least a full generation's worth of Black women for models, and she'd been embedded in Pittsburgh's Black activist circles for at least as long as Wilson had been in Brooklyn. After her father's passing, it appears that Vashon Coulter took over at least some of the running of the household, if she hadn't already. She was also positioning herself as a key node in the circulation of Black print. An 1853 announcement for the Autographs for Freedom collection lists her and her home prominently as a place where one could procure the book. We might also assume that Wilson had met Vashon Coulter on the color convention circuit, so it's unlikely that they were not strangers. Ethiop acknowledges Homewood's skill, but can't help revising the exchange, quote, what she deemed some slight, as if he didn't say what he said. He does so to congratulate himself for providing Homewood so fine an opportunity to blow foul suspicions to the wrathful winds of heaven, end quote. Ethiop's feigned suspicion turns to welcoming admiration. I bow to the beautiful response thus given profoundly. Simultaneously chastened and protecting his wounded ego, Ethiop frames this collective of women correspondents and the aliened as an important component of the community. Homewood's taking Ethiop to task and Ethiop's response suggests both understood they were treading on terrain that could be dangerous, even when joking. So back to Communipaw. Communipaw's Hen's letter, which repeats Ethiop's basic premise more venomously, bears her critique out. For Smith's Communipaw, the presence of purportedly unruly women becomes yet another sign of Day's incompetence. Day rules, or thinks he rules, a barnyard composed of women who don't know any better or simply humor him and his squeaky crowing. Either way, Day looks buffoonish and provincial. The misogynoir gets worse. Communipaw's letter includes footnotes matching pseudonyms to hen species, tapping into a general craze around hens. Writing in 1855, George P. Burnham describes the decades of obsession with chickens as hen fever, and papers often published humorous stories using chickens as a vehicle for misogynist descriptions of women and feckless men. A whimsical hen, reprinted on November 17, 1854 in Douglas's paper, claims the hen, quote, usually goes about in a vague and straggling manner, articulating to herself cacophonous remarks upon various topics, end quote. Communipaw uses this discourse to inflict maximum damage. His characterization of Mariah as a Shanghai, a species initially named for its Chinese port of origin, but bred in the United States as a kind of show bird in the 1850s, reduces her to mere ornamentation. His reference to Fanny, a Guinea hen, crows also in the spring and wears gaffs, reinforces anxiety around women entering purportedly masculine realms such as print warfare. Gaffs are spurs, often iron, attached to gamecocks or roosters. Fanny's crowing proves she's jumping into an arena where she does not belong and reinforces Day's weakness. Invoking Lucy Stone intensifies the attack on women transgressing public gender norms. Stone, a white abolitionist lecturer and Oberlin graduate of 1847 and leading figure of the 1853 Cleveland Women's Rights Convention, had started wearing baggy pants beneath her dress as part of a healthcare regime, but also as a feminist statement. Broadly speaking, these characterizations repeat widespread screeds against women speaking in public or otherwise exceeding the limits of a variously defined domesticity. Representations of Black women as overly masculine were particularly pernicious, with Edward Clay's caricatures in Life in Philadelphia a prominent, but not isolated example of how dangerous Communipaw's characterizations could be. More immediately, at least part of Communipaw's audience would have been familiar with recent conventions in Ohio, where, as Jawan Wu's essay in a forthcoming volume on the Colored Conventions movement notes, Black women took leading roles in the financing and printing of the convention minutes. Jane P. Merritt and others threatened to boycott the 1849 convention if they were not recognized formally, and Day was among the men who brokered a deal with them. Communipaw's letter then cannot be reduced to an isolated attack on Day, Day's paper, or the proposed industrial school. It was a broadside against Black women's public intellectual labor, their involvement in publics in general, and Black print in particular as thought leaders whose purview exceeded the domestic. More, Communipaw was policing the borders of the new synonymous collective he and others were shaping. His barbs remind us of the forces working against Fashion Colder, Shad, and others in masculine spaces despite, or maybe because of their skill as writers and editors. So I don't yet know how or if Mariah, Lucy Stanton, Day, or others responded to Communipaw. Homewood likely did not respond, as Fashion Colder died the next month. I imagine Stanton and others would have asserted their independence as writers while shooting back that Communipaw was attempting to reduce them to intellectual servitude. What I do have right now is a tradition of other Black women fighting similar battles. Just 3 months after Communipaw's letter and a year before becoming one of the first women recognized as a delegate at a national colored convention, Mary Ann Shadd would correct a misapprehension that she was a man. After receiving one letter too many to the provincial freeman addressed to Mr. M.A. Shadd, Shadd published in August 26, 1854, note giving would-be correspondents and the general public her, quote, name in full, Mary A. Shadd, as we do not like the Mr. and Esquire by which we are so often addressed, end quote. Like Homewood's response to Ethiop, this notice was a rhetorical gauntlet, though the paper initially maintained the conceit that Samuel Ringo Ward was the editor, though Ward was in England, with Shadd listed as publishing agent. Shadd would move to make her editorship clear in the coming months. More, one of the women watching these proceedings may very well have been 19-year-old Frances Ellen Watkins, on the verge of publishing her second poetry collection, Poems on Miscellaneous Subjects, in 1854. 5 years later, Watkins would begin a fictional fancy sketches series using Jane Rustick as her pseudonym in the November 1859 issue of the Anglo-African magazine. While not addressing Communipaw, Ethiop, and others by name, Jane takes clear aim at the attitudes that allowed and even encouraged misogynoir. Jane, like Homewood before her, called preening men on what she saw as the quintessence of tomfoolery. This talk scratches only the surface of this community as an outline and invitation to more work. As Brittany Cooper notes in a slightly different context, focusing our attention on these women offers a very different history of 19th century print culture than narratives drawing on great men or even great Black men. Fleshing this narrative out will require not only a shift in what we write, but also in our methodologies and sourcing. The Colored Convention Project's principled affirmation of, quote, Black women's centrality to 19th century Black organizing compels us to actively look for Black women's labor in narratives and spaces that have traditionally been read as male. Widening our purview to synonymous writing, sketches, and other texts published in periodicals will continue to shift our sense of Black women's print culture, intellectual history, and print culture more broadly, but only if we operate with the expectation that there's a there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Derrick. That was wonderful. And the floor is now open for questions. And if I can see the raised hands properly. Oh, Liliana Weisberg has raised her hand. So Liliana, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Derrick. A wonderful talk, and really an archaeology of something that all of us, I think, did not know or knew very little about. You have spoken about print culture and about community. And in terms of print culture, there was the invisible of the printed issues that we don't have. So there is one issue from which you have to presume to go from, to reconstruct many more and a whole culture. But there is also another part that is invisible or perhaps inaudible. Because when you spoke about community or the references you gave, they were to speakeasy, salon, and so on. It was to an oral culture. And I wonder whether you can say a little bit more about the relationship between the oral and the print culture, because whatever is specific in the print culture in your talk was also referenced to something far beyond.
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks. I always think of these things, the relation between print culture and oral culture somewhat dialectically. So things might begin in print and then make their way into the oral culture, or begin in oral and make their way into the print. And I kind of want to underscore how embedded this pseudonymous culture was in the color conventions. So these people met and they talked and they engaged each other pretty regularly on that convention circuit. And they just take those conversations to the print space. The folks in New York, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens actually met often in James McCune Smith's pharmacy in the back room. So it was literally a kind of parlor space. So that's part of it. And so they're kind of using the sort of way people engaged on the streets and in conventions and those relationships and reproducing them on the page, sometimes in the rhythms of the spoken word, et cetera, right? So that it created this kind of conversational sensibility.
This is also what I wanted to be after, the special characteristics of this print culture. By just looking at the articles quickly that you showed us, obviously just a page at a time, it was almost as if a conversation has been put into letters, and as if a theatrical part has already put it in. And even with a name like Nemo, I mean, I'm just reminded of, Greek epics or something that start from the oral culture. So I wonder how consciously this was done, what the nature of this of the articles were, and when a letter was really viewed as a written artifact. I'm going back to your quotation about being enveloped, being put in an envelope. That's a material object. And when it was more fleeting in terms of a conversation.
I think for me, it's generally both and as these things go. So to your point about whether or not they were intentionally referencing classics, Greek, Homer, etc. Yeah, most definitely. If you notice a reference to the classical tradition, if you notice a reference to sort of at the moment global print culture, so Dickens comes in and out, named and unnamed. Walter Scott comes in and out, named and unnamed. These were people who were classically trained. They attended free African schools. Vashon Coulter attended Sarah Mapp School. William J. Wilson was a principal who had a deep faith in a kind of classical education. And so that was their language. And it was sort of like, I don't know if folks have seen the movie Quills about the French. No, well, I'll drop that one. But in any case, there's a sense that even though they knew this conversation was happening in print and they played on that printedness, right? Correspondence in the newspaper referencing Douglas, they also knew that they could continue these conversations no matter the medium, and that they could leverage the medium of print to do things that they couldn't do in conversation, like have footnotes, for instance. You don't footnote a conversation, but Smith used footnotes. And then also draw on the rhythms of interpersonal conversation to carry it out. And I should also note, thinking to Elizabeth McHenry's fine work, right? When I say people consume these newspapers, they didn't just consume them, on a couch or in a chair reading alone, right? There's a sort of implication of these articles maybe being read aloud. And so there's that too, people writing and corresponding in a culture where, again, there's fluidity between the materiality of print and sort of oral culture. And the last thing I'll say on this point is there's also a fluidity between print, oral, and visual culture, because Wilson in particular described his sketches, he called them, as crayonings. So there was a sense that the written word was also painting pictures for people to see. And so he described himself, again, with reference to Dickens, walking down the streets of Brooklyn with a blue coat on. And then Communipaw would reel him and say, yeah, you thought you were Ben Franklin. Did you have like a roll of bread on your shoulder too? So there's that kind of playfulness, even with the riffing on references.
Thank you.
Comment from Doug Jones. Just want to note this: Captivating the Captive Stage, great book. It's noting that some of these essays were also written in the form of drama, right? So, thanks.
Mhm. More questions, more comments. The classicizing names of the correspondence also, I'm wondering, it's not, I guess, not just that they are classically educated, but they are claiming the classics for themselves volitionally, when so many slave names were classicizing names as kind of reverse denigrations, were they not? It would be an insult to, in a way, to give an enslaved person a very grand name, right? And your people are reclaiming the right to the classics in their writing, I think.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. And I want to signpost John Barnard's book, Black Classicism, here, and hot off the press. Unfortunately, not a pen press book, but Matt Sandler's The Black Romantic Revolution.
Uh-huh.
So when you're talking about names of enslaved people, it could be either way. Enslavers would name their enslaved people Cato, sometimes ironically, right? But when you see this happening in this anonymous correspondences, talk about this elsewhere, and but these names come encoded with meaning that people were meant to unpack. So Communipaw is a reference to Communipaw, New Jersey, for instance. And James McCune Smith goes through a thing about referencing Communipaw from Washington Irving's History of New York as this kind of interracial ideal space. Ethiop very clearly is leveraging references to Ethiopia, and he talks about his dark skin relative to Communipaw's light skin. Veritas, truth. But these names also, thinking about in terms of gender, a name like Veritas is goddess, right? So is the name Veritas referring to a kind of revolutionary era tradition, or is Veritas suggesting something else? So there are all sorts of things going on with these names, but they're all intentional and meant to be read.
Yeah.
I see, like Megan with the hand. Megan, Rob.
Hi, yes, I just wanted, sorry about my comment. I was like, I have a question. Thank you so much, Derrick, for this talk. I really enjoyed it. My name is Megan Robb, and I work on periodicals in South Asia, in the Urdu language specifically. And I look at periodicals written by non-English language speakers during the British colonial period. And so that's where some of my questions are coming from. And so I'm interested, and if you've already answered these questions during your talk, I apologize. I have a small dog. I adopted a pandemic puppy, and he was just running all over the place during this talk. So please forgive me if any one of these questions was in the earlier part of your talk. I'm curious about why the newspaper was short-lived, why it only ran between 1853 and 1855. And that kind of connects to a couple of my other questions. Was the newspaper under surveillance? And did that have any connection at all to the prevalence of pseudonyms and the fact that insiders all knew who was being referred to compared to people that might be viewed as, outsiders who might be subscribing or buying the paper for another purpose? Because this is something that I saw in some of the newspapers that I looked at from the late 19th and early 20th century in India under colonial rule. And then my last question, sorry, I'm gonna sneak one in there. I know that I learned today that William Howard Day trained as a printer. And I'm curious about whether when you're looking at the Alien to American, is everything about the layout, the format in terms of typesetting, is everything typical? Is everything, straightforward? Or are there any types of kind of technical innovations that he's doing to translate some of the ideological innovations of the content into its material form? Thank you again.
No, thank you. So I'll start with the funding question and why it was short-lived, because I think it intersects with Day as printer too. One, this is, like I said, it's not really unique to newspapers in general. It's hard to keep a newspaper going. And Day at various stages tried to get funding through the Ohio State Convention movement, various activist collectives. He was constantly trying to fundraise, but he just could not quite get over the hump. And the last sort of blip we hear about the paper is that it's potentially going to be put under new management through the Ohio State Convention circuit. And this would have been a good thing because until then, it apparently was doing everything. He was setting type, he was printing, he was writing, he was a reporter to the Ohio State legislature. Meanwhile, Lucy Stanton is likely also helping with editorial work in other matters. There's no evidence for this, but knowing what we know about Black newspapers and newspapers in general, we know that women did a lot more work than is apparent on the page. And at the same time, she's dealing with the loss of 2 children. And so in that 1853 to 1854 span, that family's going through a lot of stress, both financially, physically. Just they doing all the work for the press himself, as far as we can tell, would have taken a toll. And so his health suffered, and thinking about the actual labor of press work, right? So that's what I can say about potential reasons why it didn't last that long. As to pseudonyms and anonymity, at least the pseudonyms I write about tend to be people who are known, so they aren't trying to hide their identities. Ethiopian Communipaw, for instance, at the end of, I think, the 1852 volume of first run of Douglas's paper, Douglas says, "We're looking forward to more writing from Ethiopian Communipaw, whom some of you know as William J. Wilson and James McCune Smith." So it's not about that per se. These were people who lived their lives in public, and in some instances invited that scrutiny. Though, it's funny aside, when Douglas comes to visit New York, he goes to Brooklyn and he meets Wilson, but when he writes about it, he doesn't name Wilson. He maintains the mask. It's like, I had a good conversation with Ethiop, we had a good time, et cetera, right? So there's a kind of, back to Doug's point, there's a bit of theatricality to this too. Right?
We have a question from Peter Stallybrass. Peter?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Derrick. That was wonderful. I have a thought and a question. The thought is whether there'd be any traces of the newspaper in scrapbooks and abolitionist scrapbooks. In other words, that one of the paradoxes of newspapers, on the one hand, people think of them as disposable, but on the other hand, people are beginning to collect these bits from newspapers, and there are abolitionist scrapbooks. So I was thinking this might be a place where it's possible some of the newspapers being preserved. It'd be worth looking for that anyway. And the question is, I had never heard the word aliened before. That was a new word to me. I mean, alienation, alien, but aliened. So I had 2 questions about that. One of which was, is this an important concept that's coming up? And when I looked it up, bizarrely, the first use of it, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, from 1538, is from the point of view of the slaveholder. And it's literally the word emancipatus in Latin, the emancipation, is translated in a dictionary as aliened. In other words, alien from the slave owner, I'm presuming, emancipation. So emancipatus means from that point of view, alien from them. But then looking up one of the later definitions, under meaning estranged and alienated, is of a Black abolitionist in Ohio, J.M. Simpson, who in a collection of abolitionist songs called the Emancipation Car, one of the songs is called Song of the Aliened American, which is clearly the song of the aliened American. So I was just interested whether you could actually track the word alien, aliens, because it's such an unusual, to me anyway, such an unusual word, and see if the newspaper then is getting some kind of reception history, whether J.M. Simpson might be part of that reception history. He lives in Ohio. So in 1874, he's collecting a song called the Song of the aliened American. So I was just, I was thinking that, I don't know if you can say anything more about that word, aliened. And, it just struck me as a fascinating, because such an unusual word, at least to me anyway.
Oh, same, and thanks for those comments. I feel just a little bit ashamed because one of the first things I tell my students to do is go to the OAD, and I hadn't done yet. So thank you for that. And so a few things. One, thanks also for the note about scrapbooks and reprints, etc. One of the things I'd hoped to have done this summer is go to rare and distinctive collections here at Cornell, because we have the Samuel J. May papers and other sort of massive scrapbooks, and I hope to have been able to do some of that work. Nevertheless, the reprint industry has been really useful for catching snippets here and there and mentions and that sort of things up. And it's almost like working with Twitter. If you can't find the original tweet, maybe you can find the screen grab, right? Check the mentions, etc. But thanks for the scrapbooking tip. The short answer is I don't know if there's a direct connection in the way Alien American is getting used. My hunch is that given Day's background, and again, given the nature of this sort of culture, I wouldn't put it past them to be thinking in those terms. Day explicitly says, he explicitly frames the Alien American as what he calls a secular newspaper. It's not going to be beholden to just anti-slavery stuff. It's not going to be beholden to a political party. It's not going to be beholden to a religious organization. It's going to be a paper of cultural education and interest. So yeah, I think that could be the case without a kind of pinpoint. We named the Alien American this because X, Y, and Z. Given the nature of the culture, it makes sense to me. And there's also just a quick question in the chat about the frequency. Hard to say. It was supposed to be a weekly. They put out the first issue, and then in other newspapers, you find a notice that we put out the first issue as a way to gather more financial backing, and once our financial backing comes, we'll put out more regularly. Eventually, they start putting out, and it's supposed to be a weekly. Supposed to be. So yeah. Answer that one.
Sorry. With the aliened, I'm wondering if there's at the very least not a pun embedded in there, or maybe we're not pronouncing it right. It's lien, L-I-E-N, is of course the right to possess. And if you put an A in front of it, it's a privative. It's removing the right to possess, right? So I think that somehow may also be connected to alien as a translation of emancipated. So again, at the very least, maybe a pun using lean. Next up, Priya Joshi. Priya, you have
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So Derrick, this is so much fun, and it was great to hear it, especially after I spent a few weeks reading your wonderful book, Practice of Citizenship, after your panel at Sharp. So this is a kind of methodological question to help us just ruminate. You've got this paper, we know very little about it, but we know that it had a presence in public culture because it's written about by other people, but the actual edition, as you pointed out, we have one extant copy or one extant edition available to us. Just methodologically, you've done an amazing reading. You've uncovered and helped remind, right, about the labor of women and the extraordinary work that women did in shaping and creating the conversations that were taking place in public culture and Black public culture. But methodologically, if you were sort of training graduate students or training a young generation or a new generation of scholars, what are some of the shoals and pitfalls of this work? Like, what else does one need to responsibly say, right, these conclusions are valid? I mean, clearly you've done a lot of it, right? You've shown us the references, the cross-references, the indexing. What else is there? I mean, because medievalists struggle with this problem all the time, right? Stephen Justice's book, Writing in Rebellion, is, yeah, I have like, 5 scraps. What do I do with this? Or the Ginza manuscripts, you know, from an earlier period. I mean, methodologically, for a period that seems so relevant and resonant and immediate, and it's only 150 years old, what new tools do we need? And here I'm really asking this as a student, because I'd love to know what else we need to develop as we do this work.
I need to ask my graduate students, because one of the tools we need is in the DH realm, and I'm slowly getting competency. And so I think broad strokes, and this is especially for graduate students, the thing you need is time. I had the great fortune of having exam and dissertation committee members who didn't see a problem with my adding Frederick Douglass's paper as a text on my comps list, and the Black Abolitionist papers as a text on the comps list, Anglo-African Magazine as a text on the comps list. And what that allowed me to do was sit with those newspapers, those periodicals, and get the kind of sense for the rhythms and the language and the culture that you can't really get by, say, reading my work. Like, I can tell you things about it, but the kind of intuitive learning names, learning styles, and all of that stuff, I think it's difficult to get without just immersing yourself into the newspapers. And then on the other end of that, one of our graduate students here, Charlene Yao, just did a really great digital project where she developed a code that enabled her through Hadi Trust to get a list of all of the sort of poetry, or at least as much as she could, poetry published in Black newspapers in New York. And that gave her a really nice, robust list of what was there. And some of the students I worked with this summer were doing similar things with pseudonymous writing. Fortunately, the Black Abolitionist papers, the digital Black Abolitionist papers, just has a really, really, really long list of all the names from that collection of text. So beyond the bound volumes, just everything in the Black Abolitionist Papers Collective, there's a browsable list of names. So that's really big scale methodology and really sort of small, fine grained methodology. And I think the kind of work I'm doing, like, as I was cycling through graduate school, all of the databases were coming up. So I began a microfilm, going to the library company, trying to get physical things. And as I was finishing, accessible archives, RedX, and all those things were happening. So it really did give me a good sense, and this is what I fear for graduate students and others coming up now, that the digital stuff is so easy to just search and find something that we miss the kind of fine grain. I'm just going to sit with this paper, even through accessible archives interface. Library of Congress has now digitized their collection of Frederick Douglass's papers so you can see the pages, but I'm just going to sit with this. I'm going to go to the microfilm, because that's a different reading experience. I'm going to still apply for all of the grants and fellowships so I can go to the archives themselves and see the actual paper, how big the paper was. For instance, that's a space where you can notice one of the questions was about whether or not there were any kind of unique sort of printers innovations in the way they compose the Asian American. My answer is I didn't know anything. I didn't notice anything particularly unique. It looked pretty standard, or at least as standard as we can say any sort of mid-century newspaper looked. But that's the sort of thing that's hard to pick up on a computer screen, but becomes noticeable if you've just been looking at these pages for some time, and then you come across this thing that's got a billion columns in really small type, but some elaborate like masthead. Right? So that's the long-ish short answer of it takes time. It takes a kind of push-pull between fine-grained, looking at objects, spending time with them, and also incorporating the new ways of collecting and organizing data.
Thank you. Lara Cohen.
First, thanks so much, Derek. I mean, just echo everyone else. That was like really amazing And it's just so incredible to see how you've like woven together the pieces to reconstruct this scene. I wanted to say quickly that in response to the questions about aliened and the title of the Aliened American, that so both Day and Joshua McCarter Simpson were delegates to the 1851 state convention of the colored citizens of Ohio. And Derrick, so this all may be familiar to you, but when Day announced his plan, he announced his plan to start a newspaper, and there he said he was going to call it the Voice of the Disenfranchised. So clearly there was a kind of shift. And one thing that happened there is Simpson opened and closed each session with his songs. So I do kind of wonder if he heard Simpson's song. I've never known which inspired which, but I wonder if he heard Simpson's song and kind of readjusted the title, because it didn't appear for another 2 years. But I had a question about the kinds of collectivities that you're outlining, and I guess I'm wondering, like, if you can say more about like, do the women writers you're talking about, are they kind of inhabiting the same kind of network as, or to what extent are they inhabiting the same network as their male counterparts? And I guess I'm thinking about that particularly in light of what you were saying about how a lot of these men would have been at the conventions together and gotten to know each other and visited each other and so on. And I just wondered, were the women also kind of engaging socially with one another in person, or was this a kind of separate collectivity that existed virtually but didn't have that in-person component?
First, thanks for another lead on Aliened. It all goes back to the color conventions, I think. And I'll also say that the new collection on the color conventions movement that's coming out, I think February next year, has some really great essays that dig into just this question. Psyche Williams-Forson has an essay on Black women in boarding houses and food and all the things that's happening off-site and off the pages at the conventions. And so that's one place where you could say, at the very least, if a convention's meeting in Philadelphia, then women in Philadelphia and environs were engaging each other along those lines. They were also in the audience. Wilson, writing as Ethiop, for instance, reports back from, I think it's the 1854 National Convention, that he's sitting next to Mary Ann Shadd. He talks about just cracking jokes with Shadd at the convention. Ohio is a really interesting and useful space for thinking about this because women were so prominent in that state convention movement. And so you have this sort of threatened boycott, which suggests that women were talking together. And I forgot to mention that Stanton was involved in that too. We know that Frances Harper likely met Fenton Harper at the Ohio conventions. So the Ohio conventions as a gathering site gives us a lot of detail in the formal documents. The kinds of thinking about the questions Psyche asked: where do they eat, where do they sleep? As for boarding houses, the reports in newspapers about, again, off-site events gives you a sense of how and where people may or may not have been gathering then. And there were also, like, the female anti-slavery societies. For a while, the female anti-slavery societies would meet in New York at the same time as national anti-slavery societies. So, and Black women were delegates to those too. And so again, the short answer is yes, they were in touch with each other. At least I can safely assume that many were at various points, especially when you consider someone like Shadd or Harper, who traveled a lot. Other people like Garnett's partner, Williams, were less mobile because they were holding down all of the Underground Railroad activities, the church activities, all the other things. So it's the other sense of it. I saw, well,
we have a question from Zach Lesser.
Thanks, Derrick. That was really great. I loved how you were able to take this newspaper that we have only one issue of and then come at it from all these other angles, and the way you kind of put this network of text together to learn about the newspaper, I thought was really fascinating methodologically. And that's why I wanted to hear more about the survival pattern of the newspaper, and whether that's, you know, unusual or typical. I was just poking around on like WorldCat, which is not very reliable, but am I right that only the one issue survives, but it's not like only one copy of that issue survives? I can't tell from WorldCat totally, but they listed a bunch of libraries. And so I'm just wondering about like, what do you think resulted in the particular, like what led to the particular kind of survival pattern that we have with this, and how does it compare to other American newspapers of the period, or African-American newspapers more specifically of the period?
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out what's happening on WorldCat too. As far as I know, I've only been able to track down one physical copy, and almost all the other WorldCat hits I've seen have been of microfilm or digitized collections, which isn't to say much of anything except for the limits of my own sort of capacity to track things down right now. I'd hoped to spend some time, like I was going to drive to California, sidebar, and would have spent time sort of at Case Western Reserve and some other Midwestern repositories to try to see what I could see. The survival pattern though, and this gets back to, I think, questions about surveillance and how I know what I know. Day was the kind of person to get into fights with people. And so, for instance, in the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley published an article titled African American Literature, where he says Day should not have founded the Alien American because we already have Frederick Douglass's paper, and wouldn't it be better if Black folks just had one paper? And Day writes back and says, one, you're assuming all Black newspapers are about anti-slavery, and that's false. Two, you're assuming we're some sort of monolith, and there's constant beef between people in the Midwest and New Yorkers in particular, because New Yorkers being New Yorkers, they do what New Yorkers do. And then Day says something really funny. Like, people like to assume that white patrons give Black people sort of material, a press, and suddenly they're an editor. And then he says, that might have happened for Frederick Douglass, but that's not me. In terms of other newspapers, there are, like, one, we lost a good amount of material because of fires. So the draft riots in New York, various buildings burning down. But this gets back to the question about scrapbooking. We have what we have in large part because of, like, people, hoarding isn't the right word, but holding on to these materials. They find their way to places like Howard, to places like the Antiquarian Society and elsewhere. But it starts with individuals and reading room culture, right? So the first floor of Douglass's North Star building, the second floor was the reading room. So there was a collecting habit among readers, not just Black readers, but again, I'm at Cornell, Samuel J. May collected things. So there's that too. We have quite a few. So again, the Antiquarian Society is a great place for this, but we have quite a few extant Black newspapers. They're often located in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco, places with a kind of stable Black community that would have held, or abolitionist community that would have held on to them. I hope that gets to the question you're asking.
John Pollock.
Thanks, Derrick. Great, just fascinating. Some things I'm going to ask are piggybacking on Zach and other questions, especially in light of what you're just saying. I like the digs at the New Yorkers that came up, that were interwoven through your talk for us New Yorkers here. And more seriously, and this is not a new thought, obviously, but you know, I'm wondering about the frame that we're using of Black print culture and regionalism and regionalisms, because one of the interesting things I'm hearing is about this rich Ohio space and Pittsburgh, these highly local conversations, and yet of course also longer conversations. This has obviously been part of the work that, as you know, newspaper scholars in America have been working on, these kind of local networks that tie into larger networks, and it's the reprinting culture. But I wonder, I was trying to come up with a question about the specificity here about, very local discussions and how they make their way into print. Another thought along that line is, of course, like Peter's saying, Peter's asking about scrapbooking. I'm asking about another form of Liliana's question of what doesn't make it into print about letters. Another, I don't know, giant category of discourse. But, as everyone has said, this wonderful archaeology you've given us, I suppose letters could be even more, but maybe a few letters from these people survive. So I don't know. On the point you just made, Laura's talk last week, of course, raises this question of how to find this stuff in the small collections. So I support the road trip notion. I think Laura's talk last week is like going off the grid to you go to the big places, and then every little library would be interesting. A huge amount of work, of course, but an interesting sort of long-term project to see what one could find that no World Cat will ever get to in our lifetimes, and just not catalog stuff. The last thing is a little different. I just want to figure out a way of saying this. I found the gender conflict and crisis and conversation so fascinating, as if that seems to be both the unique factor of this paper and its Rock of Gibraltar. I don't know. Is that true? It's like that's an argument that everybody seems to be getting into. This paper is unusual in having men and women writing, but clearly challenging a lot of acceptability there. So those are, sorry, a million things, but thank you so much. And I guess the last thing before I'll shut up is, I think you were gesturing toward this, but I think you could say more in response to Megan earlier, maybe about the state and surveillance, just because the post-colonial comparison with India seems really fascinating, or not, and what works and what doesn't. We're worth coming back to.
Yeah, I'll start there and maybe work my way back. I think, especially for Day and others, there's a reason that these people whose pseudonyms were sort of open secrets were embedded in Black communities. So Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, New York, Buffalo, they're somewhat insulated, but they're also still risking a ton. Cincinnati saw massive riots throughout the 40s and 50s, as did Pittsburgh, as did Philadelphia, as did New York, right? So that's a tricky balance in terms of being surveilled. There were also people who would use a pseudonym like a woman of color, or something very, very base and vague in that way, because these were also, some people at least, Douglas included at early point in his career, were fugitives still, especially post 1850, revealing their name, date, and location as a standard correspondence to a newspaper would do. Right, you wrote this thing on this day. That's when we received it. We're printing it on this day. You're coming from this place. And Ethiop calls himself the Brooklyn correspondent. Right, Mariah is known as a New York correspondent. Right, so taking up a pseudonym in the way that I'm talking about it in this cultural folks is a very specific sort of stand, like a dedication to a particular visibility. These are public people. But again, that is to say that there are other people writing who did not do that, who did not reveal themselves. And then there's another element of visibility that gets to some of the question about the tension, or maybe just the sliding scale between very local and sort of national, transnational issues. So Day was for a time the correspondent for the Ohio State Legislature for the Alien American. He did all the stuff. He probably made the paper too, if we dug a little bit deeper. And he was able to do that in part because Ohio had this kind of wonky sort of voting law wherein, quote unquote, Black people could vote if they were sort of white passing Black people. And they sort of passed, I suppose, the paper bag test until one of the legislatures took exception to his presence, in which set up Day writing this kind of long piece about the particulars of racial logics in Ohio. And that, I know it happened because that ends up getting reprinted all over the place. So Day is getting reprinted, not just in Douglas's paper, the New York Tribune, and also just papers that were interested in the news across the country. So that's a part of it. When it comes to the women correspondents, though, there is a kind of, like, Mariah aside as this New York person, a kind of West slash Midwest vibe. So Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Ohio-ish, and very intentionally countering the way things skew New York. And then again, if you look at the page of the issue of the Alien American that we have, you also have correspondents writing in to Sierra Leone. And I think what we get from reading the Black press in general, and Day in particular, is that Black print culture is always, and this isn't some revelation, operating at multiple scales, deeply, deeply local, but also very, very transnational. I think part of the problem someone like Day and others had with Douglas's paper in particular is that Douglas's paper, and this is part of Carla Peterson's argument, like tries to make New York the standard for all of Black print and culture, right? So you read Ethiop, Communipaw, and others talking about New York, and for me, this is me, ages me a little bit, it reminds me of when all hip hop came from New York. And so to be on trend, you had to look like a New Yorker, but I grew up in Mississippi. There's no point to wearing like a big bubble coat and Timberlands in Mississippi. And so like regional hip hop develops, right? It's a similar dynamic where there's a kind of, and Douglas does this intentionally. He wants to have it both ways. He wants Douglas's paper to be the end all of Black print, even as he disavows a kind of responsibility or accountability to all Black print, right? So I hope that gets to, so that was that. Then there's the on the page, off the page thing, which some of the sources for my work, not necessarily on the Alien American, but for like the Weekly Anglo-African, have been the letters of John Jay. Thomas and Robert Hamilton, when they were trying to get the paper off the ground, wrote to John Jay for funding. And they described the project of the paper as a secular newspaper. Garrett Smith papers, another place where people with money, their papers are often a good place to find this information. Other things that were happening off page though, again, there's a tiff between Douglas's paper and the Alien American because apparently Frances Harper sent her poem Eliza Harris to Alien American for the Alien American, but Douglas's paper prints it first and labels it for Douglas's paper. And so apparently Day calls Douglas's paper out on that in Alien American, and then Douglas's paper issues a sort of apology, sort of lukewarm apology. We apologize if Alien American received this first. We didn't mean to say it was just for us, so be it. But that's another one of those sort of thinking about the materiality of the actual poem getting to a place, right? And the time lag between the document getting to a place and that document making it onto the page. Right?
Well, Derrick, I have to thank you again hugely for in presenting such a rich talk built from what at first glance to many of us would seem a paucity of evidence, and you've really demonstrated something quite different to us, and it is extraordinary work and work we want to see more of. And again, I just thank you for a wonderful and rich presentation, and you're welcome back anytime. So
Thanks to everyone for the great comments and suggestions. I'm gonna have to explode my footnotes and such now. So thank you very much. Have a great evening.